So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the WebEx session talking about functional safety standard. And compliance to functional safety standards is becoming a requirement for automotive and many industrial equipment. So today's webinar is hosted by Exida and TI. We will cover the overview of the functional safety standard, the certification steps, and the Hercules MCU family supports the various functional safety standards. We will have about 15 minutes of presentation, followed by about 10 minutes Q&A. So let's get started. So Chris O'Brien is the principal partner from Exida and a certified functional engineer. So Chris, let me get started.
Thank you, Hyman. So I'm going to provide an overview of the functional safety standards, starting with IEC 61508, and then talking about some of the derivative standards. Then talk about the steps that are required for an original equipment manufacturer to get their device certified, and touch briefly on the services that Exida provides. So Exida is a consulting and certification company, and we help our customers understand, apply, and ultimately get their devices certified to one of the functional safety standards, whether that's IEC 61508 or ISO 26262 or several other ones. And we help companies kind of in several different areas. We can engage with folks with providing training, tools such as software tools to do analysis, help to create a knowledge base through books we publish and white papers. We also help organizations as they're in the middle of a project with implementing safety lifecycle services, and then ultimately some customers desire or need for market reasons a third-party certification of their products, and we provide that also. So I want to start by talking about some of the events that led up to what I would call the modern functional safety standards, and primarily the first release of IEC 61508. So if we look at what was going on in the decade or two prior to that standard being released, you'll see that there were several very large and very costly, both from human life and economic perspective, accidents that really grabbed national and global headlines. One of those accidents was the Piper Alpha offshore drilling platform. That suffered explosions and caught fire and sank in the North Sea, and 167 people were killed in that. And that was one that kind of caught people's attention because they felt that the best practices had been used, modern equipment had been used, so how could we have such a catastrophic event when people felt they had done their best to try to prevent and mitigate that? Following that accident and other ones, the health and safety executive did a study on basically out of control, why control systems go wrong and how to prevent failure. So part of the cause of many of these accidents were control systems not functioning correctly. And as the investigations went on, it was found that it wasn't necessarily a hardware fault. It could come from many different areas. So the studies found that 44% of the root cause were from improper specifications. Either the hazard wasn't properly understood or it was not properly communicated to the design team. And then we can go around the pie chart and we see 15% was design and implementation, 6% was installation and commissioning, 15% was operations and maintenance, and 21% were changes after commissioning. So I'm going to talk in a few slides about what's called the safety life cycle, but you can see just from this pie chart that the cause of the failures came from many different areas that encompassed the whole design and implementation process. So that, if you look at the IEC 61508 committee, that was it had representation from many different countries on it. It used the recent accidents and investigations such as the Health and Safety Executive investigation, as well as other investigations to kind of inform it on what was going wrong with these automated control systems. And they used that as an input for designing and coming up with what was in the 61508 standard. Now, I'm talking a little bit about 61508 because the concepts in 61508 have then, since then, been applied into derivative standards or industry-specific standards such as ISO 26262 or IEC 61511. So these concepts of that entire life cycle and then also systematic and random faults have worked their way into functional safety practice. Unfortunately, it'd be great to say that, hey, we released the standard 15 years ago, we trained people in industry about it, and we've eliminated these, catastrophic events. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And you don't really have to go much past the evening news or the headlines of the newspaper to see it. There was recently the settlement of Toyota and the U.S. Department of Transportation. The upper right hand is an explosion that happened in the UK at a gasoline storage facility in the mid-2000s, and the lower right hand is the BP Horizon platform that had multiple failures that led to another catastrophic failure. So functional safety, the goal of functional safety is that an automatic safety function will perform its intended function correctly or fail in a predictable, and by predictable we mean safe manner. So the part that relates to performing the function correctly is reliability engineering, and that goes into the design and the fault tolerance of the system. And in predictable manner or a safe manner is understanding the process and the context and designing it for the inevitable failures, because we're never going to be able to design anything that has zero failures, so we have to design it that it's going to fail safely and not cause other problems. I mentioned the safety life cycle, and this is a flow chart for the safety life cycle from IEC 61508. Now, each standard's life cycle is a little bit different, but they all contain similar areas. There typically are three main phases. First, the analysis phase, then the realization phase, and then the operation phase. So the analysis phase addresses the question of what should the system do? So what is the hazard? How do I document that? And how do I kind of conceptually design and write the requirements of how to prevent or mitigate that hazard? The realization phase, or it could be called the design phase, is taking that safety requirement specification and breaking it into different areas such as mechanically what needs to be done, electrically what needs to be done, from a software perspective what needs to be done, going through the design process, the integration and the validation process. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's the overall planning. So planning is a very important part of the overall safety life cycle and goes in parallel with the steps. And then finally, the operation phase is how do you keep the system performing at the level that it needs to? So how do you manage change? How do you manage failure modes or demands on the system that weren't anticipated when you first designed it? So the standard is robust in that it looks at all kind of steps in the entire life cycle and has requirements and provides guidance on what should be done. The other two fundamental concepts from this functional safety standards are strength against systematic faults and strength against random faults. So, for example, a software bug is a systematic fault, and that software bug or weakness would be in every single instance of the product. And you mitigate or you minimize them through a robust engineering process with the right checks and balances and rigor in it to design these high availability, high reliability systems. Then the other area is random failures, and those would be Examples of those would be a resistor would fail sometime in its normal life, before end of life, or a spring could break in a mechanical part of a system. And there will be some low frequency of these failures, but you model them through different, you model and do failure modes, effect, and diagnostics on the systems, and you calculate the probability of failure overall for the system. So the functional safety standards implement or introduce a life cycle, requirements for protection against systematic faults, and requirements for protection against random failures. And those are kind of three key things that I think the standard teaches us. Now, the functional safety standard can be applied, functional safety standards can be applied at many levels. They could be applied at a component level, such as an MCU, an advanced MCU that's got a lot of capability and a lot of complexity. So that provides the user of that MCU with information and assurance that they can use that in their own complex system. It could be applied at an element level, and that might be a pressure transmitter or an ECU for an off-road vehicle or a safety PLC. Or they can be applied at the system level, and in this case, this is a gas turbine. I mean, so it could be a gas turbine that's certified to the process industry standard. So it's a little, the functional safety standards, I won't say they're confusing, but a difference in mindset is that many standards like electrical safety or pressure equipment standards or are prescriptive in their nature, and they apply to a very specific application with very specific constraints. The functional safety standards apply to essentially, I need a safety instrumented function or a safety goal to perform in a predictable manner, in a safe manner, or reliably, and fail in a predictable manner. So that's where you can see them applied many different scales. So the key driver of all of this is what's called a safety function or a safety goal. And that's a single set of actions and the equipment needed to identify the hazardous event and bring the system to a safe state. So an example could be open a drain valve when the tank level is too high to avoid the hazard of overfilling the tank, and that's what happened in the Buncefield accident. Could be to sound an alarm. Could be to provide the right amount of torque in the power assist steering, but not too much and not too little when it's not needed. So the safety goals scale with the project. Now an element is defined as a part of a subsystem comprising a single component or a group of components that performs one or more safety function. It can include both hardware and software, and a typical element could be a sensor, a programmable controller, or a final element. So here we're showing a sensor, logic solver, and final element. Within the sensor and within the logic solver, there could be different advanced components such as an MCU. Within the final element, you'll typically have separate devices such as a solenoid, an actuator, a valve, and those lower level constituents having safety data and even certification of those lower level elements and parts of the elements very much facilitates getting the system done. And if we break down specifically one of these elements, so if we look at the sensor and we look at the transmitter, when you're looking to apply the functional safety standards, you want to be prudent in what you include in what we would call the safety critical path. So in this case, we're looking at a transmitter that's got a sense of pressure, make a decision, condition the variables, and then write a 4 to 20 milliamp output. It also has a local interface, and it also has a remote HART communications or an auxiliary communication bus. Well, you'll notice that the local interface and the HART modem are colored darker gray, and that would indicate that they're not safety critical. So when you're doing a design, you want to be sure you include everything that is safety critical, but if it's not safety critical, you just need to show that it's non-interfering with your safety critical part. So that applies, say, to a transmitter, but it also applies to an advanced MCU that might have a lot of functionality that you don't need in every application. So having good visibility from your supplier about what's in the MCU, what failure rates are related to what parts of it, really can facilitate the design and of a safety-related function. Now, if we look at, so we've laid a little bit of the groundwork about what the standards are, and these elements are, you know, they could be controllers or sensors or analyzers within the standard. So let's move a little bit and talk about milestones to get a device certified. So key milestones are reviewing the product design and the process used to develop it, doing a product reliability and failure mode analysis, looking at how the engineering process meets the standard and how the design of the product met the requirements for the product, and then finally an audit and assessment of the product and development process. This is a flow chart of a typical project. In the center are the key steps, and we can kind of break that down into, and this is a general breakdown. If we look at that start project in green and go down on the left-hand side where we see FMEA, FMEDA, those deal with the random failure rates of the, and let's just take an electronic control unit as the example. So there's a equipment manufacturer designing an electronic control unit for an off-road vehicle. And they'll have an FMEA of their system, an FMEDA of that control board, and then they'll do a software criticality and HAZOP analysis, and if there's communication protocol necessary that isn't certified, that would be reviewed. That's kind of like the functioning of the system. On the right-hand side, the gap analysis looks at the development process, looks for weaknesses or gaps in it, and sees how it would correlate to the standards. And there might be additional training needed, there might be procedures needed, but ultimately that would be in place. The OEM would create a safety manual and be audited. Now, on the left-hand side in red are typical documentations and outputs that exida does in a project, and on the right-hand side are requirements that an OEM has to prepare as part of their safety case. So, for example, we'll look at tool justification. So if you're using a microcontroller and you're using a compiler, you have to show evidence that that compiler isn't introducing errors or compiling in the code in a way that means it isn't going to achieve the safety requirement spec or the safety function. And we'll talk about that in another few slides. So if you have a new product with no field history, you have to show the new product has a hardware analysis, and that addresses random requirements. The design used to develop that product has to follow a process that meets the 61508 requirements for the target fill level, and that's to avoid systematic faults. And then you'll have to provide a safety manual for the users so they know how to implement that product successfully so they don't introduce faults, and that's another way to mitigate systematic faults in the operational phase. So if we look at random failures, the way that they're addressed or analyzed is what's called a FMEDA, a failure modes effect and diagnostic analysis. So if we roll back to the beginning, these standards are for automatic protection systems. So you're allowed to take credit for diagnostics to either degrade the architecture and say maybe go from a 1 out of 2 to a 1 out of 1, or to bring the process to a safe state because you know your safety interlock no longer is working. So to do that, you look at failure rates and failure modes for all the components in the, and again, we're using the ECU as the example, in the ECU. So for things like, well, for many devices, exida has a very extensive component database with failure rates and failure modes, so that's an input. But then if you go to an advanced MCU, where do you get that data? So hopefully your supplier is going to have a model of their MCU that allows you to say, well, I'm using these functions in the safety critical mode, so I need to include them, but I'm not using these other functions, so they're excluded. And it would provide you that information of both failure rates and failure modes, as well as the diagnostics you need to implement to achieve certain diagnostic coverage and certain fill levels. That usually comes from the safety manual or design kit for the MCU. That information, so the FMEDA, the MCU FMEDA helps with the overall system FMEDA dramatically, and the safety manual and list of diagnostics and maybe even example code help with the software V model for the ECU manufacturer, because now they can spend their time developing the intellectual property related to their area, say off-road vehicle control, and pull from a reliable and kind of validated set of diagnostics to help the MCU be more effective and appropriate for a safety application. Just as an example of how this can be very valuable, and in fact how if you don't have that support from your MCU supplier, you can really be at a bottleneck in a project, let's look at tool justification. So IEC 61508 and the other standards require the justification of any tool used in the development process. So you go, well, why do they care about that? I write a spec, I code it, I test it, and I'm done. Well, those using the tool must know how it works, and because it could be dangerous, it could change things you don't realize, and anybody using the tool needs to know how it impacts operation. So this is an actual real-life example where we went to do a final audit on a transmitter and did fault insertion testing, which is a specific type of test that's done to confirm the diagnostics that we're taking credit for work, and it didn't find any fault. So we did a RAM test, and it wasn't picked up. It wasn't caught by the diagnostics. So what had happened as we dug into it, the software engineer at the OEM had, simply set the optimizer up one level. So the optimizer in the compiler looked through all the code and looked at stuff that wasn't really used much and removed it. So what happened is that compiled code no longer had diagnostics in it. So that is why it's very important that tools are included. So for any tool that's used, there's a requirement, justification is required, and specifically there's three categories, T1, T2, T3. Compiler is T3. So for T3, so for example, you have to have evidence of tool specification and documentation. You have to identify and mitigate failures that could affect the executable software. So if you don't have good support from that tool supplier, you're going to be trying to do all that by yourself, which may be, frankly, impractical, if not impossible, without prior use of that tool. So it kind of limits your selection of microprocessors you can use, the things you've used in the past and you have experience with the compiler with, or you need to work with a supplier that can give you good support in that area. And finally, when all of those steps in that flowchart are completed, or frankly, as they're being completed, we create what we call a safety case, and it takes each requirement from the functional safety standards, makes an argument as to why the specific design and development process meets it, records the evidence, and really creates a very robust trail as to why a transmitter or an ECU or a valve is suitable for a safety rated application. And we provide certifications. We're ANSI accredited to all of these standards. So we've been, we're an accredited certification body by ANSI, and can provide cybersecurity as well as functional safety certificates. And just kind of recapping, we provide, consulting, product certification, professional certification for people working in the industry, many different training classes, a whole suite of engineering tools to facilitate the safety life cycle, as well as a large library of reference material. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Hoi Min.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Hoy Manuel, working for Texas Instruments, and I'm working in the Safety MCU marketing. And today I would like to give you an introduction of the Hercules MCU family and why it's suitable for use in functional safety applications. So TI MCU has a very long history in supporting automotive safety applications. We are pretty well known in the automotive braking, such as ABS and stability control system. If you're driving a car today with an ABS or ESP system, the chances are very high that it's powered by a Hercules MCU. And because of its well-known hardware-based architecture, very robust development process, and also the automotive-grade quality, Hercules MCU is also widely used in transportation, industrial, and medical applications where functional safety is a requirement. So here is a slide showing the products of Hercules MCU. There are two families. One is the RM family. The other one is TMS 570 family. The RM family is targeted at safety critical applications for industrial and medical, and features the TI's highest performance floating point ARM-based MCU running at 330 megahertz with a dry zone MIPS of 550. And the operating temperature is from -40 to 105 C, which is suitable for rugged industrial application. Ethernet, USB, CAN, and UART connectivity modules are also available in our RM family. The RM family is designed and developed to IEC 61508 up to SIL 3. The TMS 570 family is designed for transportation and automotive applications. It runs from 80 megahertz all the way to 300 megahertz with a range of flash from 256 kbytes to 4 megabytes. It's for automotive, so it's a Q100 qualification supported. And the temperature range is -40 to 125 C. The automotive communication modules such as FlexRay, CAN, Ethernet, LIN, and UART are available. And because this is for transportation application, so the TMS 570 family is designed to support ISO 26262 up to ASO-D, and then IEC 61508 up to SIL 3. And for customers who are new to functional safety standards, it's pretty challenging to understand what it takes to apply the functional safety standard to its end equipment. And from a very high level, basically functional safety is about risk reduction. It's reducing risk from an unacceptable level to a tolerable level so that it can be supported, because there will be there's no zero risk in this world for any design. So the problem that we have to deal with would be, as Chris described, would be the systematic failures and also the random failures that we need to take care of. And systematic failures are typically caused by weak development and manufacturing process, inadequate supporting processes such as documentation or change management or configuration management, as well as the software and tools like the compiler queue as indicated by Chris earlier. And the random failures are failures occurring at a random time interval, causing degradation physically in the hardware. And for example, the memory, the flash memory or the SRAM memory could have a bit left because of defects. And that's what we call a random failure. For a system to be certified for functional safety standard compliance, evidence of the compliance of the system and also the element and also the component, which is the MCU, will need to be made available to the assessor. And this is very resource-intensive and time-consuming. In addition, the validity of the evidence will need to be proven. And so MCU being a very key component in an electronic programmable system, and so the data is very critical. And TI from this side will make available the safety design packages to ease the certification efforts for our customer. So I will explain the steps taken by TI on Hercules MCU to protect against both the random and also systematic failures, and the data packages made available to our customer, and how they can be used to facilitate the certification. This slide shows the Hercules MCU safety features to address the random failures. And so the TI approach here is to heavily protect critical regions of logic with hardware-based diagnostic. And this provides what we call the safe island of long good logic, and the safe island can detect failure in the remaining device then through the blend of hardware, software, and system diagnostic. And the safe island hardware diagnostic here on the chart is labeled in red, and the CPU incorporates a lockstep architecture, and is checking itself on a cycle-to-cycle basis. You can see that the second CPU in this lockstep architecture is being flipped and rotated on the die so that we can reduce the probability of a common cause failure. The flash memory and the RAM memory, they are protected with single error correction and double error detection ECC circuits. And we also have hardware-based built-in self-test engines for the CPU itself, as well as for the SRAM. This is now the factory-grade, very high coverage test to be enabled in the applications. Typically, I would say that software-based CPU self-test will probably reach a coverage of 90% maximum level, and it's difficult to be proven. On the hardware-based engine, the BITS engine, we can reach above 95%, and it's being proven by TI, so our customer doesn't need to prove the other number. And for the power, for the clock, and also the reset, we have external and internal hardware diagnostic hooks. So, as I said, all this hardware-based diagnostic provides enhanced coverage, and most importantly is a known coverage that can be used by a customer in their certification process. The blend hardware diagnostic features are labeled in blue here. And for example, all these peripheral buffers, the RAM, they are protected either by ECC, error correction circuits, or by parity. And I/O for the ADC, analog I/O, and also digital I/O, we have internal loopback to allow self-test. For devices with 2 ADC, there are shared channels available so that self-test is possible using the dual ADC cores and the shared channels. And for all the other communication modules, parity and CRC are available for error detection. And so this architecture and the safety architecture concept has been assessed by TÜV, and their assessment result is that the safety feature specified appropriate diagnostic measure that can reach IEC 61508 SIL3 and 26262 ASIL-D. And so the assessment reports can be reused by our customer as one of the evidences that the Hercules MCU is suitable to be used in a safety system where 61508 or ISO 26262 compliance is required. In one of our development kits is called high-tech safety kits. The high-tech safety kits enable our developer to evaluate the safety components. It's a combination of a Hercules MCU plus a power supply and safety monitor chip called TPS 65381. And the kits allow hardware fault injection. And based on the fault injection, and the system response can be monitored in real time. So this is one aspect that Chris touched about earlier in the presentation, is a system will fail. And the functional safety standards, one of the goals is to make sure that when it fails predictably. So here, the high-tech safety kit will allow you to look at the system response behavior when a fault is injected into the memory, into the power supply, or into the CPU, so that from system standpoint, you can understand what the behavior is, whether it's meeting the requirements or not. The second feature of this high-tech safety kit is to allow you to profile the do a time profiling of various Hercules MCU diagnostic features. So I've covered at a very high level the Hercules safety features. And so from TI side, we provide several documentation. One is the safety manual. And the safety manual really summarizes the product safety architecture and also a list of all the diagnostic features available by module. So, for example, the list of diagnostic features for the RAM, for the flash, for the CPU, for the power supplies, etc., can be found in the safety manual. We also provide the safety analysis report. One is the summary, the other one is with detail, and I'll cover the content of the safety analysis report in the next slide. So on the safety manual side, as I said, that it contains all the architecture features and also the diagnostic features by module, and also we provide recommendation whether those diagnostic features should be enabled all the time, that means mandatory, or whether it's highly recommended, etc. And then the detailed safety analysis report contains the safety metrics and also the use condition. So, for example, let's say you're using your MCU for a safety application where you are not using all the resources. Maybe you're only using the CPU, the SRAM, the flash, and maybe some I/O channels, ADC channels, and maybe the CAN module, but you are not using a timer. And so coming with the detailed safety analysis report with the FMEDA worksheet, it contains all the failure rates data down to the sub-module level of an MCU. So this allows our customer to tailor their failure rates calculation based on their actual use condition from the application standpoint. So this is something that we made available to our customer. And this FMEDA report would be very useful in understanding the actual use condition of for the failure rate of the actual use condition. And so I have covered all most of the things that we do to protect us against the random failures. So on the systematic side, we talk about that very critical is the development process. So TI is using a development process tailored to IEC 61508 and also ISO 26262 functional standard. And this hardware development process has been assessed and certified by TÜV. And so again, our customer can use this as an evidence showing that the key components in their system was in compliance, using a development process in compliance to the safety standard. And TI also provides what we call the HALCOGEN, which is a GUI-based configurator to generate the drivers. We also provide a safe TI diagnostic library, which are software API enabling the safety diagnostic as documented in the safety manual. So, for example, the safety manual documents that it's mandatory to do, let's say, SRAM test in startup using the programmable built-in self-test engine. So, in the safe TI diagnostic library, there will be an API function that allows the customer to call that to enable that self-test function without knowing all the details. And obviously, these drivers and libraries will be integrated into the application software by our customers. And it's our customer responsibility to certify their application software to the appropriate safety standard. However, TI can ease the certification effort by providing what we call the compliance support package that consists of documentation that TI software are developed to 61508 and 26262 requirements. And Chris mentioned about the criticality of the compiler tool in an embedded system development. So tool qualification is a critical step to functional safety development. And TI has partnered with Validas and make available the SafeTI compiler qualification kit. And the SafeTI compiler qualification kit was developed to help customers in qualifying the use of the TI compiler to the functional safety standards. And this process can be much less restrictive than certified compilers, because I think there are certified compilers available in the market, and typically they're certified to certain compiler configuration. In here, we are providing a compiler qualification kit so that our customer can choose their use case and then run test cases to qualify the compiler in the use conditions selected by our customer. And so, as I said, that we have been working this with a third party called Validas, and this kit has been assessed by TÜV to be in compliance with 61508 and also 26262 standard. And so TI, the compiler qualification kit, is one more way that TI is making it easier for our customer to develop functional safety applications. So I've talked about the Hercules safety architecture, its diagnostic features, and safety manual, and the very flexible FMEDA worksheet to protect against random failures. And also our development process, the software and its compliance support package, and the compiler qualification kit to protect against systematic failures for IEC 61508 and 26262 standards. Since all the other industrial or transportation safety standards are referenced to 61508, and so this means that Hercules MCU and also its supporting safety design packages are also well suited to be used in the other standards, such as machinery, ISO 13849 or IEC 62061, or process safety, the 61501, and railway, 50129, and elevator 22201. So this table shows a summary of the various safety standards and how Hercules MCU can be used to achieve the desired safety integrity level. And Chris showed a project flowchart earlier on the certification flow and what kind of activities need to be done and what kind of documentation will need to be provided to an assessor as part of the certification process. And so here, from MCU side, MCU is a very critical component in an electronic programmable system. So the documentation is very important to our customer during their certification process. So Chris talked about the FMEA and FMEDA. So from TI side, we are providing the safety manual and also the detailed safety analysis reports with the FMEDA. And the right-hand side is all kinds of documentation. For example, the code justification, the software process, the coding standard, etc., and the safety manual. Those are all made available as part of the Safety design package. And so our customer can use that to build the final safety to build the final safety case for their system. And this will help to reduce the amount of time and effort for their certification. So this concludes our webinar today. And so thank you so much for your time. And stay tuned for the future webinars. We are planning for a second follow-up webinar to have an in-depth discussion of the functional safety development and certification flow, and also some examples of how Hercules MCU documentation can facilitate the end equipment certification process. And so now we open up for questions.
Presentation mode is now disabled.
If there are any questions from the audience, the mute has been removed.
I want to remind everybody, you can mute chat questions to the presenter also.
Yeah, so could somebody read us the questions, please? Let me see if I can read that.
So there's a question, what is the difference, I guess everybody can see that difference between ASIL-D and SIL-3. They're usually considered to be similar. I don't know about the architecture. We have I'm not sure about can they use the MCU in automotive?
Yeah, I would say yes, because the only problem is with the RM is the temperature range, and the temperature range is not 125 C, and so apart from that, from functionality standpoint, I don't see a problem.
Okay, and that would be one thing to be. So on a certification project for automotive, the profile would be an important consideration, the temperature profile, and if you use a component of, you wind up there's a way to do it. You just wind up modeling a higher random failure rate because the component is used above its design rating. So that would definitely be something to consider because it may make it not able to achieve it from the numbers.
In a CIL-free application that is to run continuously for months or every year, can the self-test and this be run while the application software is running? Yes, the answer is yes, it's possible. But of course, when you are doing the self-test on CPU and also on the SRAM, that means you need to isolate the parts. That means the CPU will have to be isolated from the application. And so you need to save and restore the context. You need to run the self-test and then save and restore the context and then restart the application. But it can be done. Same for the memory self-test. It can be done, but of course you cannot access the memory, and you have to restore the contents of the memory after you finish the self-test. There's another question is, what is the source of the failure rates data included in the TI-FMEDA2? Okay, so the source of the failure rates data is based on the design database. So in the design database, we did fault injection by injecting faults into the different logic gates or the SRAM of the design, and then monitor the appropriate diagnostic circuits to see whether that fault can be detected or not. And so this is a very time-consuming process, but we did that by actually running simulation by fault injection. So it's not a pure estimation data, the experimental data based on fault injection. And second thing is, on the FMEDA report, we also have what we call the soft error rates data. And the soft error rate is induced by radiation. And the radiation can cause SRAM bit flip or logic bit flip. And so these are also experimental data that we have done on our MCU in Los Alamos lab. And so those are based on real experimental data rather than just estimation. What tools are available to verify in terms of software object code coverage? So there's a question, what tools are available to verify software in terms of object code coverage? And I'm not a software expert, so I need to take that back and get back to you. And another question is, does TI provide a basic operating system to utilize all the self-tests and set up application developer to run self-tests? So TI provides the safety manual, and the safety manual describes the different diagnostic tests that can be implemented by a system developer. But since application is very different from customer to customer, and so we do not provide a operating system to utilize all the self-tests because there are people who doesn't want to utilize all the self-tests. But we do provide functions so that people can easily call the function using the safe TI diagnostic library to build up their the self-test application software.
Sorry about this, but I can't take on your request right now. Please try again.
How long does the self-test base take? So we can provide you the number. I don't have the numbers offhand, but as you can see, the memory, the programmable memory, the best for the SRAM is obviously very dependent on the memory size. But the self-test, I can be sure is that is going to be much shorter than the software-based self-test. And but I need to get back to you on the actual time. Another question is, what is the appropriate settling for the confidence input in the TI FMEA2? If the data will be used in a system-level analysis that otherwise uses the Siemens SN29500 as the source of failure rate for the other components. So I don't know, Chris, whether you have any comments on the SN29500 versus.
Well, the Siemens tool is it's a database of component failure rates. I'm not familiar enough with the TI tool to comment on the appropriate confidence input on the TI tool. I'm sorry, I don't.
Yeah, so TI is using the IEC. I forgot the actual number. It's an IEC reliability manual.
Okay.
And the reason why there's several reasons why we've chosen to use the IEC, the reliability safety manual, the reliability data handle for FMEDA, is because it allows us to go down to the transistor level. And while the Siemens handle is based on components, so you have one failure rate for the MCU, and you have one failure rate maybe for the ROM, for the RAM. So for us, in order to ensure that we get down to the component level, the transistor level, so that we can also build up the failure rate for MCU as well as the submodule below the MCU, and to enable the customization of the failure rate calculation based on use case. And so using the SN29500 would be very difficult for us.
But do you have I think there's a question, do you have a setting on your tool for a confidence factor or confidence input?
The confidence, we have in the Excel worksheet, there's a tab that we can input the confidence level that we want to use to estimate the failure rate.
Okay. And
it can be 60%, can be 70 or 99%. Yes, the input field is available.
Okay, so I would say from 61508, you need a minimum of a 70% confidence factor for your data. So I would say using the 1H hardware approach, this is 61508 specific, although I think you could extend it. So for an architectural requirement, I would recommend 70. In the 2010 version of 61508, there was a 2H approach for redundancy, but that requires a 90% confidence interval. So I don't know the confidence interval that's inherent in the Siemens database, but for the functional safety standards, I would recommend a 70 or a 90%, depending on which architectural path you wanted to claim. Mostly, I would say 70. I think most people would want 70.
So in our FMEA2, this is a programmable feature. There's a question, will this presentation be made available for offline viewing? Yes, this WebEx will be has been recorded, and it will be posted online for playback, and the presentation will also be made available. There's a question, is the model that can do the 500 BNIFs using lockstep? or are they crossed and coupled? So we have recently do a launch of a new product with the cortex-r5 running at 330 megahertz, and so they are running in lockstep, and so 330 megahertz in lockstep with that's equivalent to about 500 BMIPS. So yes, they're using lockstep. Okay, so I think we are time's up, 11:01, and our Chris' contact information, my contact information are there on the slide. And if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email. We'll get back to you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.